Mr. Z is how I first heard of you. Your name is Zoltan Zsohar.
Yep.
But let's get started with explaining that that's not how it's originally pronounced.
Well, it's originally pronounced Zsohar, which is a Hungarian pronunciation, but we have Americanized it, my siblings and I, and so it's Zsohar now.
Okay.
But still spelled the same, and so nothing's changed except and try to make it easier for the Americans to say the name, because Zsohar is not something that people feel comfortable saying.
Now, your family is not from America. Now you're here in Texas. But what I love about your family story is that it's multiple generations of resiliency and faith and testimony to what it means to persevere. And I really appreciate that. Can we start with talking about your parents, your grandparents, and what they were going through back in Hungary?
Okay. My mother had two brothers. Her dad was a professor at a college, teacher's college there in Budapest. She was raised in Budapest, and like I said, she had her and two brothers. And the interesting part is that my dad grew up in Western Hungary on a family farm. And when he got to be the 8th grade, the tradition was you stop working and work the family farm, or stop going to school and work the family farm. And he was insistent on getting an education, in which his dad was very much against, because he needed a worker on the farm. And that was a tradition that they worked. All of his brothers and sisters were working on the farm, but he insisted to go and get an education, so he got a scholarship to go to Budapest to go to school. He happened to go to the same college that my grandfather was teaching at, my mother's father was teaching. And the interesting part about that is that my dad was such a good student that he was the only student since my mother's father that made all perfect scores at the teacher's college. So my mother's father was very impressed by my dad. And so at some point, my dad met my mother through my grandfather because of being at the teacher's college. So that's how my mother and dad connected, was through my grandfather teaching at the teacher's college. So as soon as my mother and father connected up, my grandfather was thrilled about it, because he was a smart kid. And so they ended up, my dad ended up going to get a doctorate degree in Budapest, and was teaching elementary school during the daytime and working at night in the evening after my mother and father married. And after they married, they had two children, Liz, who was born in 1941, in May of 1941, and Julius was born in 1943, in September 43.
Now that's where things got really interesting for me when I first heard your story. So your mom and dad were this young couple in love. They get married and they start having babies and building their family during wartime.
Yeah.
Have they ever talked to you about what that was like as young individuals trying to build a life and start something during such a turbulent time?
Well, the turbulent time really began when the bombings began. Up to that point, there was a war going on, and they knew it was, but it wasn't affecting them on a day-to-day basis. They'd hear about it, but not really having any real serious issues related to it until the bombings began. And when the bombings began, our sirens went off to warn the bombings were going to begin. They'd have to take the children and the valuable documents to the basement of their home until the all-clear sirens were sounded. And then they'd take the children and the documents back up to their normal living quarters. And this happened in 1943, off and on, from time to time. And then early part of 1944, the bombings began to get far more frequent. And then a lot of times my dad would be either teaching elementary school or be working at the university when our sirens went off. And so mother would have to take the children and the documents by herself to the basement of the home.
Yeah.
And then this was very difficult for her to do by herself, and then also bring the kids and the documents back up to normal living quarters. So in the spring of 1944, my mother learned that she was pregnant with a third child. And that's when my mother and dad decided it would be better if my mother and the children went out to Keystrock, which I mentioned earlier. My dad had grown up on a family farm in Keystrock, and the family was still there in Keystrock, and it was much safer there than it was in Budapest. So my mother and the children went to Keystrock, and my dad had to stay back in Budapest to continue to do his government job, teaching and what have you. And so they didn't see each other again then till August of 44, when mother gave birth to the third child. When she went back from Keystrock to Budapest, she wanted the child to be born in Budapest because it was much safer there than in a small village. And so Helen, the third child, was born in Budapest, and soon after she was born, she was baptized. And then mother and children went back out to Keystrock, and again, my dad had to stay back at the family farm. My dad had to stay back in Budapest while my mother was in the family farm because, again, my dad had to do his government job.
Okay.
So
let's provide some more context to the people listening who might not understand what was going on in the region. So from what you've said, the Nazis installed a Nazi-friendly regime in
that's
Hungary.
correct. Yeah.
And so who was bombing Hungary at the time?
It was the Allies.
Okay.
It was Allies, and it started out, the British and the Russians started to bomb, but the anti-aircraft that the Germans had put in place discouraged those bombings. But when the Americans started bombing, they had much more sophisticated planes and were more successful bombing Budapest than were the British or the Russians or even the French.
And what did the people like your parents and the rest of the people of Hungary think of the war coming onto their soil? What were their thoughts on both sides?
Oh, it was awful. They had never imagined that would happen to them.
Wow.
It was a beautiful city that was now being bombed. And
that's something we
devastating.
hear that, I mean, people from Venezuela, people from Cuba that started out with great middle class, average lives, and next thing you know, their lives are completely upended and
Exactly.
everything's changed. That's something that I got from your story, where your father, what did he study? Zoology, anthropology?
Anthropology, yeah.
He had
Botany.
a great life and
Oh, yeah.
apparently a very
He was-
well-to-do family.
Yeah,
What was that like for them?
They were doing very well. My mother came from a life of privilege.
Yeah.
Father being a president of Teachers College, her grandmother, my mother's grandmother, did all the cooking, so my mother didn't have to do any cooking at all. She was very well taken care of, real life of privilege. And then my dad joined in that, and there was a little bit of a conflict between my mother's family and my dad because mother's family wanted to help out a lot with finances and things like that. My dad was way too proud for that. So he wouldn't have any of that. So they got to be a little bit of a conflict then between my great-grandmother and my dad. But they resolved it pretty well, but it was always a little bit of a conflict there because of my dad was a real proud man. He didn't want any help.
Well, and then so your mom, growing up in that privilege, not really having to do much in terms of the things around the house, I'm sure, she then was taking care of the children alone and having the third child added while your dad was in a different city completely.
Exactly.
Did she ever talk to you about those changes and how she learned, how she got through it?
It was a huge difference. Yeah. I mean, she went from a life of privilege in a big city to a rural farm, and a city girl, on a farm, a small village. Everybody recognized that she was not from here, and being a city girl, so she had to work really hard to convince the farming community that she belonged there.
And how'd she survive? I mean, how were you guys getting food?
They lived on a farm, so they had plenty of food there, but she needed to convince my dad's grandmother, who was living on the family farm and who was kind of the matriarch there, that she was worthy of being there. So she had to win her over, and that was her goal. She said, I have to win Mama, they called her, over. And so she worked really hard. When Mama started cooking, she'd go in and say, can I help you? And I think she tells a story that when she really won the whole village over was when a calf was being born, and she insisted on watching a calf being born. And they said, well, if somebody can do that, then they belong here. So, so
Now she's a country girl.
she's now a country girl.
Oh, geez. Okay. Well, I have so many questions about that, but that puts us at 1944.
Yes.
And from what I've heard of the story, 1944 was a big year for the family, especially around Christmas.
Yes.
Can we get into what happened then and pretty much the miracle that occurred?
Sure. What happened was my dad had accrued some vacation time. And he's in Budapest. My mother and children were in Kisrakos. He'd accumulated some vacation time. He wanted to see the family at Christmas time, but he never promised my mother anything about when they might see each other again, even for Christmas, because he wasn't sure whether he'd take the time off. And number one, that was number one. Number two, he had to get permission to travel. He wasn't sure to get permission to do either one, even for Christmas time. But fortunately, right before Christmas, he got permission to take a few days off and travel to Kisrakos to visit his young family. So on December 23rd, he packed up his bags and went to the train station at Budapest to catch a train out to Western Hungary. When he got to the train station at Budapest, he found out that there was no reliable train transportation out to Western Hungary at all. As a matter of fact, the entire public transportation system was in chaos as a result of the bombings. So he decided he'd see if he could hitchhike out to Western Hungary. So he's very fortunate. He got several rides, usually in the back of open bed trucks. And it was brutally cold in the back of those trucks.
Yeah.
And from time to time, the vehicle would break down, so they had to repair it along the side of the road. And it took them 24 hours to make that 150-mile trip from Budapest to Kisrakos. But he arrived on Christmas Eve afternoon in Kisrakos, and what a wonderful reunion that was. You see, the Hungarians celebrate Christmas Eve, and what a gift it was for my family, for my dad to be there that Christmas Eve. And they knew it was a special gift and a special blessing because so few families could be together because of the war, and so they felt very, very blessed to be there that Christmas Eve and celebrate the gift of my dad being there. They learned the following days even more of a blessing than they had originally thought, because the following day they learned that the Russians who had invaded Hungary to drive out the Germans had, on Christmas Eve, just hours after my dad had left Budapest, surrounded the city of Budapest, had sealed it off, and there was fierce fighting going on in the city of Budapest. And like I said, this happened just hours after my dad had left the city. So now my dad didn't know when he'd be able to go back to Budapest, but at least they were together as a family. Mm-hmm. So a couple of days after Christmas, my dad became ill. He came down with something called pleurisy, an inflammation of the lungs. And usually it was probably caused by being in the back of those open bed trucks, that long ride from Budapest to Kisrakos. But he became very, very ill. He was so ill, he was bedridden. But that was the good news. A couple of days after that, he got a draft notice to join the Hungarian army. And the Germans were forcing Hungarians to draft any man who could walk to join the Hungarian army, which was run by the Germans. But because my dad was ill, he was able to get a letter from his doctor saying he was not fit for military service. So he was able to avoid the draft and be able to stay with the family.
Yeah. So that's, not only is that nice because he could stay with the family, but what were his thoughts about the idea of fighting with the Germans?
Well,
what were the Hungarians' thoughts?
The Russian troops were far more powerful than the Germans, and even combined with the Hungarians. So it was going to be a futile attempt. It was almost going to be a suicide mission for those people, because what happened back in Budapest when all this war was going on, I told you earlier that my mother had two brothers. Well, they were drafted at that time. And one of them, to this day, they don't know what happened to him. And the other one's severely injured.
Okay, and so from what I've heard of that history, as the men are getting drafted, the women are left, and they're kind of left to fend for themselves and the kids. I'm sure this was the case with your mom. Did you ever hear, were they very nervous about what was happening as the Russians came? Because the Russians were quite cruel to the people.
Oh, absolutely. Well, as the story goes on, of course, there's what happened in Budapest with my mother's side of the family. And there was a lot of things that were happening there. But what my dad had learned as in the spring of 45, that the Russian troops by that time had captured Budapest and were moving toward the west. Mm-hmm. And as they were moving toward the west, they were committing all types of atrocities on the general Hungarian population. And that's when my parents decided that they were going to flee Hungary into Austria. And so this happened in late March of 1945. when the Russian troops were advancing. And so my dad and mother decided that they were going to flee Hungary into Austria ahead of the Russian troops. And so as they began gathering belongings to take with them, they realized they didn't have enough baggage or suitcases and crates or anything to take everything they wanted to take with them. So there hadn't been much lumber set aside on the family farm, but there had been some lumber that had been set aside for my father's grandmother. I talked about her a while ago, and that had been set aside for her coffin. She was 79 years old, and she made it clear she was not going to be leaving the family farm. And she wanted my dad to take the lumber that had been set aside for her coffin to build some wooden crates. She told my dad, she said she wasn't worried about what would happen to her after she died. She'd let somebody else worry about that. Right now, she wanted my dad to take this lumber and build some crates, which my dad, he quickly built 3 wooden crates. And in those crates, they put food, clothing, cooking utensils, whatever they thought they might need for a long trip, without having any idea how long the trip was going to be, or even for sure where they were going. So soon after midnight that night, that they got everything packed and ready to go. And but they didn't have any transportation to get into Austria. Austria was about 15 miles away. But they were able to find a farmer nearby who had a horse-drawn cart that agreed to take them to this village that was near the border. And there my dad felt for sure that he'd be able to get some kind of transportation into Austria. But so late or very early that morning, that after they got everything packed, they loaded their belongings on this man's wagon and began that 15-mile journey from Kiesrakos to this village near the border. And as they were traveling toward the border, they could look back and see the glow of the villages burning in the background, where the Russian troops were that close to them, that as they were traveling toward Austria. So they arrived at it was from Friday morning that they arrived in this village near the border. And my mother stayed with they unloaded their belongings off this man's wagon. My dad paid the man. He went back to Kiesrakos as they had agreed. And my mother stayed with the belongings along the side of the road while my dad went into the village to see what kind of transportation he could find into Austria. What he found in the village was chaos and panic. Hundreds and hundreds of other Hungarians had heard exactly what the Russians were doing. And they too were trying to flee Hungary into Austria. And it was a chaotic scene at best. And so my dad spent almost a full day trying to find any kind of transportation at all, anything at all to get he and the family into Austria. He found nothing at all. So he went back to where mother and children were waiting with their belongings along the side of the road. By that time, other Hungarian families had gathered there as well. And they were all trying to figure out how in the world can they get into Austria. And as they were trying to figure this out, it seemed like from out of nowhere came 2 men on a wagon pulled by 2 oxen. And they approached the area where my parents and other Hungarian families had gathered. And the 2 men announced to the group that this wagon and oxen belonged to a wealthy count nearby. And the wealthy count had a large farm. And he didn't want the Russians to benefit from the wagon or the oxen. So he told his workers to take the wagon and oxen to this village near the border and see if someone could use it for transportation into Austria. So my dad had grown up on a family farm. I talked about that earlier. And he was not the least bit intimidated by these enormous oxen with these huge horns. So he immediately spoke up and said he would take the wagon and the oxen. The 2 men gladly gave him the wagon and the oxen, and they quickly left. And now my parents had transportation into Austria. How great was that?
Yeah.
And so they put their belongings on the wagon, and they realized there was still some room on the wagon, so they invited another family to join them. And the 2 families began their journey toward the border. And as they were getting close to the border, they joined up with 16 other wagons to create a wagon train. You see, not only had the Hungarian government had collapsed, but the Austrian government had collapsed as well. And there was all types of criminal activity going on in the area. And a wagon by itself was a very easy target for criminals, but they tended to stay away from large groups of people. So these 17 wagons decided they would travel together as a wagon train into Austria. And as they were crossing the border from Hungary into Austria, they could look back and see not only the glow of the villages burning in the background, they could see the actual flames of the villages burning in the background, and they could hear the gunfire between the Russian and German troops. So they knew they needed to get into Austria as quickly as possible. By the way, this was Good Friday of 1945. So they traveled all night that Friday night, and all day Saturday, all night Saturday night, stopping only long enough to let the animals feed and rest, and arrived in Graz, Austria on Easter morning of 1945.
Fascinating correlation with the holidays and these big events for your family.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. I want to go back quickly and talk about what kind of decision making was present when it was decided to leave family behind. Was that very hard, and have you ever talked to your dad about that?
It's very hard. It's very hard for them to leave. But it's when you have the kind of fear
Yeah.
that was going on. I mean, the family was already trapped back in Budapest, and so they had to do what they needed to do to take care of themselves at that point, which they did. There was atrocities happening in Budapest that were awful, and they didn't want that. They had an opportunity to prevent that from happening to them.
Yeah.
And so that's what they were looking at, is they didn't know where they were going, but they knew what they were getting away from.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point to make, is that they knew they didn't want to have to deal with the Russian atrocities they were committing. So it was the only choice they had.
Yeah, hard decisions had to be made.
It's a hard decision,
and
but
there's that consistent lesson too of that nuclear family, the concept of the mother and the father protecting the children. That's what I see a lot
Exactly.
in your story.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys, or your family, you weren't born yet. Your family crosses into Austria. What happens there? Is there border patrol? What is going on with the transition, and how do you guys then become refugees?
Well, there was border patrol, but they were letting everybody leave.
Okay.
It was a massive exodus.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's not just the Hungarians; the German troops were there as well. They were fleeing ahead of the Russians as well. So they had to actually wait hours at one point to let the German troops have access to the road, and then let the Hungarians who were escaping, fleeing Hungary, following the German troops out. So it was a massive exodus out of Hungary, and but like I said, they were committed to traveling as quickly as they could and to arrive in Graz, Austria. And again, keep in mind, they don't know where they're going. They have no idea where they're going. They know where they're going away from, but they don't know where they're going. So when they get to Graz, because they traveled, as I mentioned, all night and all day, that they felt like they'd put enough distance between them and the Russian troops that they needed to kind of figure out where they were going to go from there. So they checked around, and they found out that the Allies had divided Austria into 4 zones. Mm-hmm. There was Russian zone, which is where they were, and you didn't want to stay there. You didn't want to deal with the Russians. And there was a French zone and British zones, which were not too far away, but they were told if they went to the French zone and the British zones, the French troops or the British troops would send them right back to Hungary where they just come from. Didn't want that.
No.
And so they learned that the American zone was much further out toward the west. And they were told if they can reach the American zone, that the Americans would allow the Hungarians to decide whether they stay in Austria or return back to Hungary, or do something, go to a camp of some kind. Mm-hmm. So they decided that their goal would be to reach the American zone, that the American troops would allow them to either stay in Austria or go back to Hungary or go to some camp of some kind. Mm-hmm. And so they decided they'd make their goal to reach the American occupation forces, in at least the American zone for sure. And so they traveled in generally westerly direction. And what they decided to do, they decided to take the back roads rather than the main roads, because the main roads, they felt like they'd run into criminal activity on the main roads, and far more likely to run into Russian troops if they stayed on the main roads. So they decided to travel the back roads. But traveling the back roads was very, very slow. They traveled day after day after day, and days turned into weeks. And after about 3 weeks, they began to run out of food. Now, you talked about food earlier on the family farm. There's a lot of food on the family farm, and the grandmother insisted that they take a lot of food with them, which they did. But so many people left in such a chaos, in such a panic, that they took little or no food with them. So those that had food shared with those that did not, until finally after 3.5 weeks, they had completely run out of food, even for the children. And that in my mother's evening prayer, she prayed to the Lord, she says, Lord, we need some help with food, especially for the children. And she remembered what her father said, never lose your faith in the Lord. So she prayed to the Lord, said, Lord, we need some food, especially for the children. It's one thing for adults to go hungry, but something else for the children to go hungry. So please do what you can to provide us food. And when she finished the prayers, my dad began reciting his favorite Bible verse, the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And my mother joined in, and the two of them recited out loud the 23rd Psalm. And when they finished, they were able to relax and go to sleep. The following morning, my dad got up and decided to see if he could find some work for food. So he walked a little ways and found a farmhouse, and there he met the farmer's wife. And he explained the situation to the farmer's wife. And the farmer's wife explained to my dad that her husband was a prisoner of war, and she wasn't sure when he'd be released, and that she needed her fields plowed for the spring. So my dad had worked, been on the family farm. He says, he can do that. He can plow her fields, or the Hungarians can. And so he took his oxen, hooked it up to her plow, and began to turn over the soil. As the soil turned over, potatoes began popping up, one after another, after another. The fields had been planted in potatoes, and nobody told them.
Wow.
And so they ended up spending 2.5 days there plowing this farmer's fields, ended up with sacks and sacks of potatoes, many of which the farmer's wife shared with the Hungarians, in addition to the food that she had originally promised. And what a wonderful answer to prayer that was.
Yeah.
So they now could continue their journey toward the west. A week later, they crossed the Enns River. And they learned two things after they crossed the Enns River. One is that it was May 8th, 1945, and the war in Europe had ended. And the second thing is they were now in the American zone. But they didn't know where the Russian troops were. And they still didn't trust the Russian troops at all. So they decided they wouldn't feel safe until they could know where the Americans were. They wanted to see the Americans before they felt safe. So they continued their journey toward the west. And a week or so later, they came to a mountain range and decided to cross that mountain range rather than try to go around it. And as they began going up the mountain pass, they realized that a lot of the mountain pass had been washed out by the winter rains and the snow melt. And so it became very treacherous, very physically demanding, very, very difficult crossing those wagons over that mountain range. And finally, after 2.5 days, they reached the valley on the other side, and they camped on the banks of the Tron River near the village of Obertron. Then the following day, as they were packing ready to move forward, they learned that the Americans were only 3 miles away, and they had closed all roads in the area and had halted all travel in the area in order to restore law and order.
Okay.
And so they finally, my parents, after 7 weeks, had felt safe because they knew where the Americans were. And they were grateful that they didn't have to travel any longer because they were exhausted after all the travels that they had been through for that 7 weeks.
And how old were the kids around this time? 3, right? There was 3 of them?
Three children.
Okay.
And the following day was my sister Liz's 4th birthday. And there's kind of an interesting story around that, in that mother wanted to do something really special for Liz for her 4th birthday. But she didn't have any money, and she'd trade away most of her jewelry for food along the way. But she still had a small gold necklace. She thought if she could just trade that small gold necklace for some bread. She knew how much Liz loved bread. It'd be something that would be doable. It'd be something that would be practical, and that she could do that Liz would really love. So she decided she'd go into the village of Obertron and see if she could trade this gold necklace for some bread. So my mother spoke really good German, as my dad did as well. And so she goes in the village of Obertron and finds the bakery. It's in the baker's home. And the baker answers the door, and mother explains her situation. She wanted to buy some bread with this gold necklace and for her daughter's birthday. And the baker realized right away that she didn't have a ration card. And he said, without a ration card, he said, I can't sell you any bread. He says, I can't even give you any bread. He said, ration laws are so strict that he has to account for all the bread that he bakes. And he said, furthermore, he says, I would never take that gold necklace for bread. That just would not be right. So he says, I'm sorry, there's just not anything I can do for you. So he closes the door, and my mother begins walking away. And the baker almost immediately opens the door back up and beckons for my mother to come back. He says, wait here. And the baker goes into his kitchen where his family had just sat down for breakfast and takes his family's ration of bread off the table and gives it to my mother and says, here, take this, it's a gift. Tell your daughter to have a happy birthday. Mother took the bread and took it to where they were camped on the banks of the Tron River, gave the bread to Liz, who shared it with her brother Julius. Mother says, you've never seen 2 kids with bigger smiles on their faces than those two kids eating that fresh baked bread. Kind of gives you a whole new meaning. The expression of the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. A quick footnote of that story. From that day forward, until my mother passed away in 2003, she could not bear to throw bread away. And she just could not even bear to even think about throwing bread away. She'd get angry if she saw anybody throwing bread away. That's how powerful that story was for her at that time in her life. It's amazing.
Wow. And so you guys are now close to the Americans.
Yes.
What happened next?
Well, next, now they know that they can't travel, but they feel safe for the first time in 7 weeks because they know where the Americans are. So they need to focus on 3 necessities of life: food, clothing, and shelter. Now, I just mentioned without a ration card, food was going to be a problem. So my dad and another Hungarian man had learned that the Austrian Forest Service was one of the few employers around the area who were hiring forest workers, lumberjacks, to cut trees in the forest and deliver them to the lumber yards. And if they went to work for the Austrian Forest Service, they'd get paid cash and get ration cards. So they decided they'd go to work for the Austrian Forest Service. My dad and 12 other men, 13 men, decided to go to work for the Austrian Forest Service. After 3 weeks, there was only one of those 13 men still worked for the Austrian Forest Service, and that was my dad, because the work was so physically demanding and so incredibly dangerous that all the other men quit. They either were going to work off some public assistance programs or try to find another job, but they couldn't bear the difficult and dangerous work that was being a forest worker. But my dad refused to accept any kind of public assistance programs. He was determined to provide for his family. And by working for the Austrian Forest Service, he'd get paid cash and get issued ration cards. Now, he got issued ration cards for food, but the village leader there, they call him the Burgermeister, refused to issue a ration card for clothing. He said you had to be an Austrian citizen to get a ration card for clothing. You see, the Burgermeister didn't want the Hungarians to stay there. Austria had been through a long war, and their resources were scarce, and they didn't want the villagers to have to share any resources that were available to them with the Hungarians. So the Burgermeister wanted to make it as difficult as he possibly could for the Hungarians to stay there. And one of the things he did was refuse to issue ration cards for clothing. But somehow, my parents were able to get the clothing that they needed when they needed it. It may not be what they wanted, but it was what they needed when they needed it, especially shoes, because they walked a lot and they wore out the soles of their shoes. So they were able to get clothing when they needed it from time to time. Now, housing was another issue. While my dad was working up in the mountains cutting trees that summer of 1945, they were still living on the banks of the Tron River. And
Camping? Or what did their shelter look like at the time?
It was a wagon that they had along the way. They turned it into a covered wagon, so they had a little bit of shelter there, but they were living basically outdoors. They were camping.
Yeah. And it was okay, kind of, because it was the summer, but it was going to get cold.
And now they were getting ready to go into the winter, the harsh Austrian winter, so they knew they needed to find some kind of shelter to survive the cold rain, wind, and snow of the wintertime there in the mountains of Austria. So they needed to find some kind of shelter. So my dad was working up the mountain, mother was trying to find a place for them to rent. So she'd see a house for rent and go check on it and say, I'm sorry, it's just been rented. She'd see a couple rooms for rent, go check on them, says, they've just been rented. And it would happen over and over and over that summer of 1945. But they knew they had to find some kind of shelter. So my mother had, by the end of the summer, had made a friend with one of the local ladies there. And the lady finally confided to my mother, said the Burgermeister told the villagers not to rent to the Hungarians. And if they did, there'd be severe consequences for it. And everybody feared the Burgermeister. He ruled that city, that village. So nobody would rent to my parents, but they still need some kind of shelter. So mother had noticed that there was a small stone building at the base of the mountain that nobody had been around all summer long. It was about 14 feet by 16 feet, about 220 square feet, very small area, one room stone building. And so nobody had been around, so mother decided to check to see what the story was around it. Well, she learned that it was an abandoned building, but she also learned that there was no laws against occupying abandoned buildings, and the building had been condemned as not suitable for human habitation. But nonetheless, they thought, since there's no law against occupying abandoned buildings, let's see if they couldn't just fix that up for a temporary shelter just to make it through the wintertime. Hopefully in the spring they'll be able to go back to Hungary. So with the help of some kind neighbors, they were able to put windows in the window openings, door in the door openings. They put a wood burning stove for heat and cooking, but there was no electricity and no running water. So but the 5 of them moved in this small stone building just as a temporary shelter, just to make it through that cold Austrian winter, with the idea that when spring came, they'd be able to go back to Hungary. Well, when spring came, they began to get letters from home, and the news was not good. I talked earlier about the atrocities that the Russians were committing. Well, the Russians had decided to stay in Hungary, and they were imposing communism on the general Hungarian population, and were forcing the Hungarian government workers to pledge allegiance to communism. And if you did not pledge allegiance to communism, you were beaten and thrown in jail or worse. And the family back in Hungary knew that my dad was a government worker, and that my dad would never pledge allegiance to communism. So they emphasized to my parents, choose safety, choose where you are, rather than come home. This was devastating news for my parents, because now they had to completely accept the fact they were displaced persons. They were refugees. They had no place to call home. And they knew that it might be a while before they could find a country that would take them, because these countries that were taking refugees or displaced persons were first taking their soldiers back from war and putting them into a domestic economy jobs. And then what few jobs were left over were usually low-paying jobs that couldn't support a large family, maybe support a single person or maybe a couple, or at the most a couple with 1 child, but certainly not a family of 5. And so my parents knew it might be a while before they could find a place that would take them, but they never gave up. They were determined to find a new home. They were determined to keep looking. They always had hope that they would find a new place, and they always had faith that somehow they would find a new home. So what they decided to do is, let's just make it through another season of the year. They made it through the spring, through winter to the spring. Let's just make it spring through the summer. And maybe something would come up by summertime. Nothing. Then the fall of 1946, still nothing. The following winter, still nothing. And then spring of 1947, still nothing. But something did happen in spring of 1947. I was born. I was born in May of 1947. And I won't go into the details around my birth except to say 2 things. One is, as you can imagine, I was an unplanned child. But the second thing is that there was a young Austrian doctor whose misdiagnosis contributed to the fact that I was an unplanned child. So I was born in, like I say, May of 1947 in the closest hospital to Obertron, which was in Bad Ischl, which is about a 20-minute train ride from Obertron. And now when I leave the hospital to come into this temporary stone building, now there's 6 of us in there. Parents and 4 children. Still, no place to call home. Still trying to wait for an opportunity to go to another country and find a new home. And so still trying to make it through another season of the year. Let's just make it through the summer of 47, certainly something will open up. Still nothing. Fall of 47, still nothing. The fall and winter, still nothing. The spring of 48, still nothing. The summer of 48, still nothing. Finally, in the early part of fall of 1948, they got some wonderful news. They learned that Australia had changed its immigration laws, and the occupation of the head of household was not an issue, but the size of family was. They wanted to limit the size of family to a family of 6, 2 adults, 4 children, which is what we had. And my parents were delighted for finally, after all this time, 3.5 years, to have a country that would take them. So they sent off for the application and the forms, and they completed the application and the forms. And just when they get ready to turn everything in, my mother learned she's pregnant with the 5th child. That disqualified them from going to Australia. And they were devastated, as you can imagine, especially my mother. She decided to blame herself for the pregnancy. She was very upset. They were really very crowded in this small stone building. They didn't need a 5th child. They didn't want a 5th child. And this time she couldn't blame it on a misdiagnosis of the Austrian doctor. And she totally blamed it on herself. She's very upset, very distraught, very bitter that entire winter. And she thought things couldn't get any worse. And they did. On March 8th, 1949, and which is, today is March 8th.
Oh, you're right.
Okay, but this was in 1949.
Okay.
That and 73 years ago, yeah. And that my sister Helen became ill. She began to pass blood in her urine. And the doctor didn't know what was causing it, the problem. So they put her in the hospital in Bad Ischl where I was born. And my dad had to take off work to be with her because they were running tests day after day after day, and they needed somebody there, some family member there with my mother while she was there in the hospital. And it was my dad, because my mother couldn't spend hardly any time with Helen in the hospital, because as soon as Helen got sick, the other 3 children got sick with whooping cough. So he had 3 sick children in a small stone building with whooping cough, and one in the hospital with some disease, didn't know what it was. What they did learn was that Helen had a really low red blood cell count, dangerously low blood cell count, but they couldn't figure out what was attacking the red blood cells. So they decided to run a test, and day after day after day, and they still couldn't find out what was attacking the red blood cells. So finally, after several days, Mother was able to make arrangements to visit with Helen in the hospital. And while she was there with Helen in the hospital, 2 doctors came in and began to diagnose or talk about the diagnosis of the symptoms of the low red blood cell count, and try to figure out how they could treat it. Well, the younger of the 2 doctors suggested that maybe they would do a blood transfusion. And the older of the 2 doctors says that if to do a blood transfusion would be experimental at best, and the only chance of it having any success at all would be if an exact blood type to Helen's blood type. And so they checked around the hospital and found out the only person that they knew that had an exact blood type as Helen was my mother. And she was 8 months pregnant. And that's when the older doctor says, under no circumstances would take blood from a woman who's 8 months pregnant. Too dangerous for the mother, too dangerous for the child. The younger doctor insisted that that may be the only thing that can help Helen. So the 2 doctors got into a really very serious argument over this blood transfusion, until finally the older doctor just had enough of the argument. He said under no circumstances would ever allow blood transfusion from a woman 8 months pregnant. It's not going to happen. Forget about it. Doesn't want to talk about it anymore. And so this is all happening right in front of my mother. So now my mother's feeling even worse about this about this not being able to do a blood transfusion because of this pregnancy. So she's feeling terrible that this pregnancy keeping her from maybe treating Helen. So she leaves the hospital that day. It's about a 10-minute walk from the hospital to the train station. And as she's walking toward the train station, she stops at a very busy intersection to allow the traffic to clear. And as she's waiting there, a little girl around 10 or 11 years old walks up and grabs her hand. And Mother's so deep in thought, so upset about everything that's going on, she didn't pay too much attention to the little girl. But then finally, when the traffic clears, she crosses the road, and the little girl tightly holds onto her hand till they get to the other side of the road. And the little girl then lets go of her hand, scampers off. And Mother thought, well, that little girl just needed somebody to get her across that dangerous road, and trusted my mother, a person she didn't know, to get her to the other side of that road. And so Mother didn't think anything else about it. Well, the next day, late in the evening, there was a knock at the door. It's a neighbor from across the street. He was one of the few people in the area who had a telephone. And he told my mother that my dad's on the phone and he needed to talk to my mother right away. So Mother goes over to the man's home, and my dad's on the phone. My dad says to my mother that Helen has taken a turn for the worse. She's unconscious, she's in a coma, and the doctors think she's going to die that night. So he told my mother he knew that the last train had already run that evening. He told my mother to take the first train out the following morning and to bring with her a dress to bury Helen in, and also her favorite toy doll. If Helen survives the night, he's going to stay by her side. He went on further to say, but if she dies during the night, he's going to meet my mother at the train station in Bad Ischl. So Mother understood, and so she hung up, and she went back to where the children were, and she began to think about losing a child. And as she thought about losing a child, she realized how much she loved children. And as she thought about how much she loved children, she thought what a blessing it was to be carrying a child at that time. And then she began to feel terrible about all the negative things she said and thought about that unborn child. She was just feeling awful about it. And then she decided what she'd do is just pray to the Lord and ask the Lord for forgiveness for all the negative things. So she began praying to the Lord. She said, Lord, please forgive me for all the negative things I've thought about this child, all the things I've said about this child. I really want this child. And Lord, you know how much I love children. Lord, you know how much I love children. And as she's praying to the Lord, she says, but Lord, why? Why me? Why me? Why is all this happening to me? Why? And then she remembered what her father said, never lose your faith in the Lord. Never lose your faith. And as she was thinking about this, how can she possibly deal with everything that's going on in her life? And then somehow during that thought process, she thought about that little girl from the day before who grabbed her hand and trusted my mother, a person she didn't know, to get her from one side of this road to the other side. Why can't she trust the Lord to get her through this situation? Just like her father said, trust the Lord to do his will. And once she realized that she needed to put it in the hands of the Lord, she reached up to the Lord and said, Lord, it's in your hands. Whatever your will is for me, that's what I'll accept. And when she turned everything over to the Lord, she said she had a peace and tranquility that came over her, such that she was able to go to sleep, even with the children coughing all around her. The following morning, she got up and took the dress that she was instructed to do and the doll, went to the train station in Obertron to catch the train to Bad Ischl. When she got to Bad Ischl, there was my dad on the platform. She knew what that meant. That meant that Helen had died during the night. She was very upset, very distraught, as any mother would be, knowing she just lost a child when she got off the train. She gets off the train. My dad runs up to her and says, hurry, we need to get to the hospital quickly. We need to get to the hospital quickly.
Oh my gosh.
And mother's saying, wait a minute, she's 8 months pregnant, she can't run. Furthermore, if Helen is dead, why do they need to get to the hospital quickly? And said, what's going on? My dad realized he needed to explain to my mother that Helen was not dead. She was indeed still alive. And that somehow during the night, this older doctor who so vehemently had refused to do the blood transfusion had a change of mind and a change of heart.
Wow.
And had agreed to do the blood transfusion. So mother went to the hospital as quickly as she could, and the nurses already had a cot down beside Helen's bed. And mother laid down on the cot, and they did a direct arm-to-arm blood transfusion from mother's arm into Helen's arm. And a few minutes after they finished the blood transfusion, Helen opened up her eyes and said, Édesanyja, which in Hungarian she said Édesanyja, which in English means dear mother. So the doctors were cautiously optimistic about this blood transfusion to the extent that they agreed to do a second blood transfusion the following day. The following day, my mother went back to the hospital, and this time Helen was awake and alert, and she didn't want anybody sticking any needles in her arm. So she fought the doctors and fought the nurses for quite a while until finally they had to do what they call a cut-down procedure. They had to actually cut open her arm where they do the blood transfusion to find a vein to put the needle in to do the blood transfusion. So they finally did that and finally did the second blood transfusion. And a little bit after that, Helen stopped breathing and became unconscious. And the doctors thought she was dead. And so they said they were ready to declare her dead. And my dad says, no, we're going to do CPR on her. So he got over her chest and started pressing on her chest and said, breathe like this. Until finally, after what seemed like hours, she began to breathe on her own and showed real signs of improvement. And so it's interesting that a nurse that witnessed this told my dad later on that what he had witnessed was a father giving life to a child for the second time. So after that, Helen began to improve day after day after day. And 10 days later, mother went back to the hospital and gave birth to the 5th child, Julia. And 10 days after Julia was born, mother, Julia, and Helen, all three went home from the hospital the very same day. Now, a couple of footnotes about that. They never did know, to this day don't know what Helen had. They do know other children in the area had similar symptoms, all of which died, even those that had a blood transfusion.
Wow.
Leading most to believe that there must be something in the blood of a pregnant woman that was able to attack whatever was attacking Helen's red blood cells, to the extent that Helen was able to survive and none of the other children were, which leads you to believe that it was likely that the pregnancy that my mother did not want saved Helen's life.
Wow.
The second part of that story is, from the time Helen left the hospital she knew what she wanted to do. My sister Helen got a master's degree in nursing, a doctorate in education, and taught nursing for 29 years at the University of Utah. She still lives in Utah, and I was with her last month in February. Spent several days with her. And by the way, she still carries a scar on her arm where they did the cut-down procedure. So now there's 7 of us in this small stone building.
Mm-hmm. And where are you going to go?
Where are we going to go? We don't know. And so let's just make it through another season of the year. Let's make it through the summer of 49. Still nothing. The fall of 49. Still nothing. Finally, in January of 1950, they got a letter from Church World Services. Church World Services said the United States had changed its immigration laws. And the size of the family is not an issue, but the occupation of head of household is.
Okay.
And they wanted either unskilled or semi-skilled workers. So my dad, as I mentioned earlier, grew up on a farm. He decided he couldn't come to America as a farm worker. So he goes to Linz, Austria, to meet with American officers, which were in Linz, and told the American officer that he wants to come to the United States as a farm worker. And the American officer said, well, let me see your papers. So he showed him the documents. And the American officer looks at him, sure, Dr. Zsohar, you're a farm worker. Yeah, you got a doctorate degree to be a farm worker. And my dad had to convince the American officer that he knew farming techniques. He knew how to operate farming equipment. He knew how to maintain farming equipment. And he went on further to convince the American officer that he could be a forest worker because he'd been working in the forest for the past 5 years. And he convinced the American officer that he could do that as well. The American officer took a real liking to my dad. He said, look, I'm completely convinced that you can come to the United States as a farm worker or as a forest worker. I'm gonna put you on the quota for forest worker because it pays more. But let me tell you something. He says, you don't have to be a forest worker, you don't have to be a farm worker, you don't have to do any of the jobs that are on the quota system. You can do any job you want to do when you get to the United States. Right now, we need to get you and your family to the United States under this quota system. And my dad was delighted to learn now that they qualified to come to the United States. So he goes back from Linz back to Arbitron to wait word from Church World Services, who's making the travel arrangements. And a couple of weeks later, he learns from Church World Services that travel arrangements have been made and they can begin their journey to America. So this time with great excitement and great anticipation, they packed those same wooden crates that they had fled Hungary with to begin their journey to the United States. So they take a train from Obertron, Austria to Linz, Austria for a couple of days, from Linz, Austria to Salzburg, Austria for a week of orientation. And then from Salzburg, they go to Bremerhaven, Germany to wait for transport to the United States. On February the 18th, 1950, they boarded General A.W. Greeley to cross the Atlantic to the United States. They arrived in the United States on March 3rd, 1950. Now this was no ordinary crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. The New York Times wrote an article about this ship's journey over the Atlantic Ocean. I have a copy of that article. Here's a copy of that article. Let me just read you a little bit about what the New York Times said about that journey that this ship made across the Atlantic Ocean. The article dated March 4th, the day after we arrived, after we arrived in New York. The headline reads, "Transport docks after rough trip." The Navy Transport General A.W. Greeley arrived here yesterday from Bremerhaven, Germany with 1,301 displaced persons. The vessel was 3 days behind schedule after a voyage that included a slight collision, a storm, and being hit by a bolt of lightning. On February the 19th, in a dense fog in the Straits of Dover, the Greeley collided with another transport ship, and only the seamanship of Greeley's master averted what might have been a serious crash. The damage to the Greeley was minor, and the ship continued its journey. 10 days out, while the ship was rolling in a very heavy swell, she was struck suddenly by a tornado-like gust that came up without warning. All passengers were ordered off the deck, and while the order was being carried out, a blinding flash of lightning struck the bow of the ship and traveled the entire length of the 496-foot transport. Luckily, no one was hurt by the electrical charge.
Wow.
So my parents knew they'd been on a rough journey across the ocean, but what they didn't know was the day before the ship arrived, the Thursday before the ship arrived on Friday, that Church World Service had been notified by the local sponsor that they had to withdraw sponsorship of the family. The local sponsor was from a place called New Windsor, Maryland, and there was a measles epidemic in New Windsor, Maryland. And the city was quarantined. Now, it was basically shut down, just like what we've been experiencing here with the pandemic. And so that nobody could go in or out of the cities. So the local sponsor notified Church World Services in New York that they had to withdraw sponsorship of the family. Now, you had to have a sponsor for all families that would guarantee that they would not be on a public assistance program for 2 years. So the Church World Services looked at their list of potential sponsors, and they saw where Central Presbyterian Church in Waxahachie, Texas, had made some inquiries about sponsoring the family in the summer of 1950 to pick cotton in Waxahachie. And so Mr. Anderson with Church World Services decided he'd call the church in Waxahachie to see if they'd take the family early. So he calls the church in Waxahachie, and the Reverend Don Swain answered the phone, pastor at the church, answered the phone, and Mr. Anderson said, would the church be willing to take a family early? Well, in the Presbyterian church, a pastor cannot make that decision. That should be made by the ruling elders of the church, which is a session. So Reverend Swain told Mr. Anderson he would call an emergency meeting of the session that Thursday night, and then he would get back with Mr. Anderson the following day and let him know what the session decided. So the following day, that Thursday they did meet. The session met and agreed to take a small family. Yeah.
You're kind of a large family.
So the next morning, Reverend Don Swain calls Mr. Anderson, and he tells Mr. Anderson the session met last night, and we would prefer a family with few children. Mr. Anderson thought, he said, 5 children.
Oh.
We got exactly what your church would prefer. When they started making the travel arrangements, they realized there'd been a misunderstanding. But Reverend Swain says, tell the family we'll take them anyway. So this was finalized about noontime that Friday after the ship arrived at Manhattan Island. And so now they're getting off the ship in Manhattan and learn that their new destination is a place called Waxahachie, Texas.
Now, I consider that a blessing. If you're going to end up in America, I would like to be placed in Texas. So that's quite nice.
Yeah.
I'm curious, too, of what was your family's understanding of the situation happening with the no more Maryland, you're going to Texas. Were you told about it at all, that there was a problem, or did you just get the alert that you're not actually going to
They were told it was a problem, that it was a new destination. New destination.
I can't imagine the stress.
Yeah, and it was a surprise for them. And here's kind of interesting part. They were in Grand Central Station waiting to waiting for a train to Texas, and a Hungarian man recognizes them from being on the ship and comes up to them and says, where are you going in the United States? And my parents said, well, we're going someplace in Texas. We can't pronounce the name, but it's someplace in Texas. And he said, Texas? That's the worst place in the United States. It's hot, it's flat, there are no trees there. You're gonna hate it there. It's nothing like Hungary. So now my parents were so excited about going to Texas and wondered, what are they getting themselves into now? But they did board the train that night and traveled from New York to Dallas, arriving in Dallas at Reunion Station on March 5th, 1950. And when they get off the train, they're waiting for somebody to greet them. And they're waiting there for a few minutes when they notice 5 couples coming toward them. And these 5 couples were dressed in their absolute immaculate Sunday best clothing. And my parents thought, well, that must be the people from the church because of the way they're dressed. And those 5 couples saw 7 of the most bedraggled looking people they'd probably ever seen, still looking like they'd come off the ship. And they said, it must be the refugee family from the way they look. And the couples embraced us like we never expected. My parents knew immediately they were where they belong. This was where they belong.
For some more context, what is Church World Services? Was it a charity, and how did they get the resources to help other families?
Their focus is working with immigration groups there, and they were contacted. My parents made early on as an organization that could help them find a country that they can go to.
Do you know if it was started after the refugees were created by World War II?
I think it'd been around for many years, and it's still around to this day.
Okay, because I know a lot of friends of mine are helping right now with the refugees from Afghanistan, for example. And so it's really great to see now that people are still welcoming the families and helping families of interpreters, families of commanders, over from Afghanistan. It's nice to know that over the decades, those same groups are still
Yeah,
helping others.
yeah.
That's great. And are you involved with them at all?
I've contributed to them from time to time, but I'm more focused on the church that sponsored us.
Okay.
And I still contribute to them regularly. The 50th anniversary of them sponsoring us to America, in other words, March 5th, 2000, we set up a scholarship fund at that church. My dad insisted that we do that as part of the 50th anniversary of them sponsoring us to Waxahachie. So we still have a relationship, more of a relationship with them than do Church World Services. But they do a marvelous job, though. All those groups do.
Okay, that's great. I'll have to look more into them too to see what work they're up to now. So how old were you when you guys got here? And were you kind of coming of age? Were you starting to realize the world around you? And what did you know about the whole situation?
I knew very little. I was
Okay.
2.5 years old.
Yeah.
And my early memories are people from the church coming to the house, checking on us, make sure everything's okay, and just trying to assimilate us into the community, and which was wonderful because we made some wonderful lifelong friends from the church. We were the first Hungarian family in Waxahachie, and they weren't sponsoring any kind of foreign families in that city at that time.
Okay. I'm curious now, how did your parents, who went through so much, how did they pass down those lessons and values that they gained along the way and experienced to you, considering you were only 2 when you get to America and you're going through all this? How did they make sure that you grew up grateful for what was in front of you, thanks to everybody who made those sacrifices?
They did everything.
Yeah.
I mean, from making us understand the importance of food. If you put it on your plate, you ate it. Nobody's gonna put it on the plate. You put it on your own plate. But what you put on your plate, you eat. And education, education, education. And it was all about getting educated. And we maintained a lot of our Hungarian traditions for Christmas time and different celebrations that we had there. So we maintained our Hungarian values in a way. But at the same time, we were becoming Americans. And it was difficult for some time, my dad, in particular, my mother, to some extent, to accept the fact that we were veering away from our culture a bit. I'm not bothered by that. I appreciate that they left that with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
And before we were filming, you were telling me about your dad, how he had a harder time with America's youth when it came to teaching.
My dad was a
Why
teacher.
was that?
My dad was an elementary school teacher in Budapest. And when he came to the United States, of course, they didn't speak any English at all. They spoke German and Hungarian. And the interpreters here, they found some people that spoke German that could help be interpreters here in Waxahachie. And so, but my dad learned pretty quickly that his old European, I'll call it, mindset was not going to work well with the discipline, because he was a highly disciplined person. We were very disciplined in the house, and that was not going to work well with the youth and children in America. So he pretty much gave up the idea of teaching early on. And when he came here, of course, he didn't know the language, so he had to do odd jobs. Now, I mentioned earlier, my dad had a doctorate. He was very well educated. So he was working as a janitor for a while. He was doing odd jobs here and there and doing what he could to learn the language and get settled in this country. And a lot of times what happens here, and all of us find ourselves guilty of this to some extent, is when people don't speak your language, you don't really appreciate that they're smart as they are. And he felt like a lot of times he was being taken advantage of because he didn't speak the language, so he got pretty upset about that. But he finally got a job working as a grocery manager at Tom Thumb's store in South Dallas. And then he started teaching art here. Art was always his hobby, so to speak. When he was at the university in Budapest, he did the illustrations for his professors for their books. whenever they needed a drawing of something, a floral drawing or anything like that. My dad did all that. And so he had a hobby of art, and so he began teaching art one-on-one as he's learning the language. And he got to be well known as an art teacher. And then he went to work for the city of Dallas in Dallas Park and Rec building, teaching art in the city of Dallas and in Park and Rec. And then he started teaching art at some of the junior colleges around, which he did up until he stopped working in his mid-80s.
Okay. And so that was his kind of career in America. What did yours look like, and how was your youth and then turning into an adult? What did you see for yourself?
Well, now I'm talking education again. I'm getting back to that. When we got to the United States, my sister would have been in the second grade. I think she would have been third grade. They put her back to second grade. My brother had put back to first grade, so they moved him back a year. And then I hadn't started school at that point, and my sister Helen had not either. But as my sister Liz, my brother Julius, sister Helen, the three older ones than me, I'm the middle child. They made amazing grades in school. They did marvelous. I mean, they were third or fourth in their class. I came along, I was having a good time. I was not the best student. So my dad had a lot of difficulty with me because I was more wanting to play sports, which I couldn't play organized in school. It always had to be out in the yard kind of stuff. So, and my grades were not that, my grades were okay, but they were not that like my sister, my older siblings. But fortunately, going through a small school like Waxahachie, you got the benefit of the doubt. So everybody said, here's another Zsohar, got to be smart. So I got a little bit of the benefit of the doubt there. But I went on to UTA and got a mechanical engineering degree there, and then went to work for, day after graduating, went to work for Mobil Oil Corporation and had a 30-year career with Mobil. And then when Exxon and Mobil merged, I took early retirement, and that's when I wrote the book. And it was about the same time my dad became ill, and he passed away as I was began working on the book. And that's when I went to my mother and said, I need your help finishing. And at that point, I didn't know it was going to be a book. I know it was a story I wanted to share with my kids. Mm-hmm. And I knew that there was a story here. It was a powerful story because I knew how it affected my life. Once I heard the story, I mean, it changed my view of the world.
When did they begin telling you?
When it's in 1975, we were living in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Had a daughter, Laura, who was turning 2, and mother was pregnant with the second child. Shirley was pregnant with the second child, my wife. And mother came up to help us out. And so we were living in Michigan, and so I told mother, I said, I'm going to take you for a drive around some of this beautiful area here around Kalamazoo, Michigan area. And so we're driving around that day, and she starts telling me this story. And I'd never heard the story before. I knew there was a story there, but it was a subject we didn't talk about at the dinner table. It was never brought up. Only thing I knew was that my sister Helen, I talked about earlier, was ill at one point. And anytime there was a Christmas or birthday, she wanted a nursing doll or something related to nursing. And that's all I knew. She'd been sick, but I didn't know any of the details that I shared with you a few minutes ago. But yeah, we were driving through the countryside there in Michigan, and she started telling me this story, and I could barely drive. I mean, you know, it blew me away. And so transferred back to Dallas in 1981. And then I went down to Waxahachie after that, and I talked to my dad, and I says, Mother told me the story of what happened fleeing Hungary and in Austria and how we got to the United States. And I says, I would like for you to tell me that story. And I'd like you to tell me and let me put it on tape. And he surprised me, he said, yes. And so so I'd come over and he'd say, what do you want to know? And I said, just start talking. And so he'd tell me a lot about his life growing up and things like that. And then he'd tell me bits and pieces of the story until I probably have 8 or 10 tapes of him telling the story.
And you still have those?
Yeah, I still have those. And that's what I used to transcribe it to come up with the story. But what happened as I was transcribing them, there were questions that I began to come up with. And I needed answers to those questions. And like I said earlier, my dad died just as I was beginning to do that. And so Dad died December 6, 1999. And so early part of 2000, I was getting ready to retire because of the merger in ExxonMobil. So I went to my mother and I said, I'm working on putting this story together, but I've got pieces that are missing. And she says, your dad told you everything. I can't add anything. And I says, can we just talk? Mm-hmm. Let's just talk. And so I knew what was on the tapes. And she started telling me this stuff. And I says, none of that's on the tapes. And I says, I need to bring my tape recorder and I need you to work with me on this. And so at first she says she didn't want to do it at all. And then over time, I'd show up, she says, where's that tape recorder? And she began to get all these documents out that from way back that they had saved and all this information. And she gave me a completely different side of the story. As we were talking earlier, my dad had everything down. We were here, we went to here, we went to here, we went to here, we went to here, and here. Mother says, I felt this way, I felt this way, I felt this way, I felt this way. And the two stories combined is what's in the book.
Wow. You then tell me that you went to Europe and your mom had all of these feelings that I've been here, I'm not feeling positive about this space. Can you talk about what that was like, and did she struggle to see everything again?
Yeah, we went to this one village where I mentioned earlier, I was tired, I wanted rest, and it was a beautiful bed and breakfast place, and I wanted to stay there, she didn't want to stay there. And I couldn't understand why, so I finally had convinced my sister, who was there with us, to convince Mother that it's okay to stay here. And the following day, I had the tape with me that my dad had taped, and I put it in the tape player. And I said, Mother, here's the reason that we went to that village. And my dad starts talking about it. She said, turn the tape off. I turned it off. She says, what you don't understand is what was going on when we were there. Helen was sick. This was a different sickness than what she had when I talked about earlier. She was sick, she was malnourished, and she said, I was taking care of the children. And she says it was not pleasant. And that's when I realized there's feelings that were coming out. When my dad talked about being at these places, Mother was talking about what was happening at those places.
Wow, Mama Bear.
Mama
Bear.
And so that led me to view the story differently. Mm-hmm. Because being a male, I was like my dad.
Yeah.
And so I had to transition my mindset to there's another side of the story.
It's interesting because right now I think today you hear a lot of people talking about men and women forgetting their natural roles, especially in a family unit, and you have such a great example of that, of the male perspective and role during such a traumatic experience over many years, and then the mothering and nurturing role of what experiencing that same thing is like. Two tales. I can't believe you have the accounts from them individually. I think I'm curious though, what are your thoughts on the fact that they didn't tell you for so long? Like, I can't believe that you were with them and you had your own kids and then she started to tell you the experience?
When you talk to people from the World War II era, it's not unusual.
Okay.
And I've talked to a lot of people who, I've told them what I've done, and they've come up to me, a lot of them have said, my parents or grandparents mentioned something briefly about this and I didn't pursue it, and now the story's gone. And so there was a reluctance, there's very much of a reluctance to talk about what happened during the war. What's interesting, when my dad started talking about it at the tape, it's amazing, it like opened up a floodgates. Because at dinner, all of our family dinners always went back to the story then. We could talk about it now, it's okay. And it just kind of got bigger and bigger. We started getting more and more of the story out. It was wonderful that it happened that way.
Yeah. Is that how you are passing it down to future generations in your family now too? It's
Yeah.
more of an open conversation?
Yeah.
And what do they think about it?
As I mentioned, my siblings older than me, I ended up writing the book. It's been the biggest blessing for me. It's been able to share this story with so many people, because it's a powerful story. It's completely changed the way I look at the world. I mean, things that I think are problems, or a lot of people think are problems. To me, it's an inconvenience. You know, it's nothing at all. Problems are when you have Russian troops on your tail, and you don't know where you're going, and you got a family you got to take care of. You got to feed them, you got to clothe them, you got to shelter them. That's a problem.
What are your thoughts on how weak Americans these days, especially Gen Z and millennials, seem to be when facing problems, and what they perceive to be problems versus what real struggles look like throughout history and today? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I certainly do, because people need to understand this story. Mm-hmm. Every generation needs to understand it. Now, we've traveled overseas since I've been an adult, and I see what a privilege is to live in this country. And most people don't appreciate that until you've gone overseas, any place just about overseas, particularly if you go to a third world country, and see what a blessing we have here. It needs to be protected. It needs to be protected. But I think the most important thing is people need to understand how fortunate we are to be in this country. And when you hear stories like this, and what's going on in other places in the world right now, where people are fleeing really horrible situations, that it can happen. It can happen anytime, and it can happen in this country. But we cannot be complacent. We have to understand that we've got a real blessing here to be here, and we need to protect that. And I appreciate it because I know the story, and I get a lot of feedback from people who say that read the book, and tell me, I need to give this to my kids. They need to understand that this can happen. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't believe it can happen. They're into their cell phones or into whatever they're into, and are not really paying attention to what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I think we're so far removed from reality that we have a hard time even comprehending that stuff could happen to us. But I believe what really helps is hearing the stories of things like your family going from well-to-do, happy, I mean, the pictures in the book of you guys strolling in the prairie, and then knowing that just a few days later, things drastically changed for your lifetimes. Yeah. That's pretty shocking to me. And the more we paint vivid pictures of what can happen when our freedoms are at risk or when our safety and security is at risk, it's going to be helpful for young generations. So thank you for telling your story. We really appreciate it.
I want to mention one other thing related to what your question was just then, is every year for the last 11, maybe 12 years, I'm scheduled to do it again into this month. I talk to fourth graders, have a Christian school, a Patriot Day, and they have me come in, first person to speak to them every year for those years, because of the importance that they place in having the children understand this story. And I think that speaks volumes to me that school wants their children to hear this story. And they've called me. They called me a couple weeks ago to arrange for me to speak again this month.
I love that.
And
I love that.
It's fourth graders.
Well, what I like, we've been doing this for 2.5 years now, and it's not that I've sought out stories of people saying it was family and faith that got them through these things, but it just happens to be the case that pretty much every person we interview will say that it was their family, it was their desire to seek freedom, and it was the faith that they had. All of those things led into them getting through the hard times. And especially when it came to getting to a new country and starting a completely new life, having to leave family behind, getting through all the challenges. It's those same core principles. and those are being abandoned in America today. So being able to tell stories rooted in faith and family especially, I think are going to be very valuable moving forward.
Yeah.
I want to, before we show the box and the saw, can you just give a brief rundown on what you do with the church now? You said you're involved with them, and I want to make sure that we give them a shout out.
Yeah, I'm involved in 2 churches, actually.
Okay.
I belong to Preston Hollow Presbyterian Church, and I've served there as a deacon, and I've served in the Presbyterian Church overall as an elder as well. But more importantly is Central Presbyterian Church in Waxahachie that sponsored us. We go down once every year when they give out the scholarships to the youth there. We're part of that program there, and I still support that church in the same way that I support Preston Hollow. Most people don't know that. I'm not publishing there, but I do. I support both churches financially because of the enormous impact that they had on our family from the time we arrived in Waxahachie to just about to this day. And I cannot leave that. I have to keep that connection.
For sure. All right, let's bring in the box and the saw. Okay,
Yeah.
so what do we have here?
Okay, I use this saw. I take this in all the presentations that I do on this program. At the point where I say that my dad was the last person working for the 13 men.
Yeah.
And I put this up, and I said, this is the smallest of the 3 saws he takes up on his mountain with him every day, to give you an idea how physically demanding this job is. It was incredibly physically demanding. And because my dad had done such a good service for the Austrian Forest Service, that when he announced to them that he was coming to the United States under the quota as a forest worker, his management told him to take the saws, even though they belonged to the Austrian Forest Service, that he was going to give my dad those saws that he could use in America for his occupation, which was going to be working in the Forest Service, which he never did. But we kept the saws, and there are 3 of them. I got 2 others plus this one plus an axe. Wow. That we've saved. And yeah, this is one of the 3 wooden crates that was made from the coffin wood of my great-grandmother in Kiesrakusz. And as they were beginning to flee Hungary into Austria, and in these crates they put the food, clothing, cooking utensils, whatever they thought they might need for that long journey. And the amazing thing about it is this is a smaller, there are 2 crates this size and 1 larger. And this size is very heavy just by itself. And you can imagine how heavy it was with being full of whatever they put in there, whether it was cooking utensils, food, or whatever. Mm-hmm. It got to be extremely heavy. So the men who would put these on and off the wagon had to be really strong to be able to lift these up and put them down. I've always been amazed at the strength that they must have had to carry these heavy crates. Even the oxen carrying these on the wagons would have been really heavy. So it's amazing. I'm blessed to have this. It was made in 1945, and we still have it to this day, and all 3 of them.
Wow. Well, thank you for bringing those items. Yeah. It really makes it quite real after hearing the story. I know a lot of people probably want more details after this, and I know a lot of the details are in this book that we haven't touched on in the video. Can you talk about how we can get our hands on our own copies of this book and how we can stay in touch with you and support the work that you've done to spread the story?
Well, you can get this through me, or it's published by Brown Books, and they can contact me and let me know that you're interested in buying the book. It's been a wonderful blessing to be able to do this. There's a lot of detail in here that I don't have time to share about the story, but I'm very, very blessed to be able to have written this book and to be able to share it with people like yourselves.
Thank you so much. I'm going to call you Z now. Apparently that's what everyone calls you. Yeah. It's funny because the team calls you Mr.Z. That's what we've been calling you this whole time. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you for writing the book, putting it in words, and then also taking the time to join us on the show today. If you guys want to buy his book, Surviving Through Faith, it's so detailed, so special, and I'm really thankful that I got to read it. You guys can go to the link in the description to buy your own copy. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Hey guys, it's Morgan. Before we head out, I just want to say thank you for watching the Freedom Records, and thank you so much to American Journey Experience for letting us film here in Dallas, Texas at their vault. You guys, this place is filled with world and American history artifacts. It's fascinating to learn the details of the objects that are right behind us on set. So thank you to American Journey Experience for letting us film here, and actually, you guys can come here yourself, so go to the link in our bio to learn how you can do that and how you can get connected to this great place.